Hi everyone, welcome to another Music is a Journey video. I'm Peter Scove, and today's topic is first wave black metal. This topic is of particular interest to me because when I was about 15 years old, I was really interested in a lot of the bands, at least the ones that were available in my local record store. So of course I was listening to Venom, later on moving up to Hellhammer and Celtic Frost, Bathory, and there were a few others as well. But, you know, times went on, my musical taste changed, and I kind of left all that behind for a while. I went back to first wave black metal a few years back when I was exploring more about black metal, with particular focus on the 1990s black metal, especially out of Norway. And as I was watching videos about that and reading up about the roots of it all, I found, of course, those old bands I used to listen to were mentioned quite often. Plus, there were some other albums that I didn't have and I had never actually heard that were also mentioned. And so, at that time, I also picked up a few more. Now, as it so happened, about 2 months ago or so, when I was opening up YouTube to take a look, see what there was of interest to watch, one of the recommended videos was Quest for Metal. The Quest for Metal channel, the guy on there was doing a tier ranking of first wave black metal albums. And from the thumbnail, I could guess some of the albums I knew, so I watched the video. And of course, there were a lot of albums I knew and albums that I had, plus there were a bunch of albums I hadn't heard of before. So this intrigued me because it means there was more to learn about first wave black metal that I didn't know yet. So after watching Quest for Metal, I ended up watching a few more. Let's see here. So I watched a video including a very detailed explanation of first wave black metal by The Gentleman Critic. He had a very detailed video on his channel, very comprehensive as well. A video on first wave by Jelimnice Occultist. Okay. And there was also a first wave debate on Banger TV. And as well, S&T Young, he often features, I think basically his channel is about extreme metal, mostly death metal and black metal and thrash metal. He featured a video on, he did a video featuring his first wave black metal albums, so that was really interesting. And let's see here, Wyatt Exim's, I don't know how you'd actually read it, but anyway, Wyatt Exim's 2 videos, let's talk about first wave black metal and punk's influence on black metal. I also checked a very comprehensive list of first wave black metal albums on Rate Your Music. I read a blog post on Thrown Into the Fire at wixsite.com and checked tier maker rankings of first wave black metal albums. So from what I gathered, when you talk about first wave black metal bands and albums, you can probably break it down into 3 tiers. The first tier are the really popular, well talked about bands like Hellhammer / Celtic Frost, Bathory, Venom, Sarcophago, and a few others. Then you go down to the second tier of often mentioned albums or often mentioned bands. So bands like Sodom, Japanese Sabbath, Sepultura, Blasphemy, Volcano, Bulldozer, Master's Hammer, and quite a few others as well. And then in the third tier you have albums by bands who, well, those albums may or may not be included depending on how strictly you want to make the criteria. So for example, Destruction's EP, Sentence of Death, that one there is usually included in the first wave black metal discussions. However, the second album, Infernal Overkill, is sometimes put in and sometimes not. And there are some other albums as well which I saw some people were including but other people were not. And there was even one album which nobody else included but one guy included, and I thought, yeah, I can see how that would fit in there. So yeah, we have those kind of 3 different tiers then. So what exactly is first wave black metal and what is not? Well, one of the things is that the second wave, or the black metal that came out in the 90s, had a very distinctive sound that separated it from other styles of extreme metal, particularly in the way the chords were played, and I think in the overall feel of the songs. There was just something different from, say, like thrash metal or death metal or whatever else was around at the time. But in the 1980s, basically we're talking about any kind of extreme metal is based on thrash or based on just playing very fast. I see thrash metal and first wave black metal as having kind of 2 different distinct styles. Thrash metal, I feel, is more like the kind of rough, street tough, aggressive style, playing very fast. The vocals are kind of more like shouts or shouted barking, barking not like a dog, but that kind of style. I also feel the playing aims for more technical precision, high speed precision. If you picture it like as let's say like a car, or like a roadster, for example, thrash metal is like the roadster that's made for the city streets. It really has a roar to the engine. The vehicle vibrates with the sound of the engine, but it is quite well tuned, so that vibration goes with a well-tuned engine. It can roar down the streets and it can corner really nicely, which is a kind of a metaphor for the more kind of precise and technical playing of thrash metal, or at least how it very quickly evolved. Black metal, first wave black metal, I see as more like the kind of Mad Max roadster, which is actually not really meant for the roads. You can take it off-road, you can drive it over anything. It has all sorts of armor plating and spikes welded or riveted on, and the car rattles, but it rattles really noisily because of all this extra plating and stuff that's on it. So that's kind of a metaphor for how I see the difference between 1980s thrash metal and 1980s first wave black metal. Yes, they both share the common speedy playing and aggressive sound, but I see that black metal has more of a rugged, rough, rattling, gruff, primordial, visceral type feel to it than thrash metal. So basically it starts, the years given are 1981 to 1991, and I suppose that could be disputed, but that's generally the years I hear people talking about. So who exactly started black metal? Well, there are some disputes there. Most hotly debated whether it was Venom or Bathory. Now, Venom get credit because they have an album called Black Metal and a song called Black Metal from 1982. I did read somewhere that there was a group in 1978 who had a song called Black Metal Master, but it is such an obscure song that it is only that one time I saw that written, I think in a comment in a thread about black metal on Reddit or somewhere like that. So Venom is usually talked about as being more of a speed metal proto-thrash band, basically picking up from Motorhead and just making it a little more like wilder and dirtier and meaner sounding than Motorhead. Whereas the other argument, Bathory came in with, I feel, quite a distinct and different style that doesn't really hint of either Venom or Motorhead. Although people say that Bathory's name is inspired by the song Countess Bathory of Venom, I've also heard that is disputed or debated. Not really sure. For me, Bathory's sound is closer to what I was hearing, what I heard from the 1990s, especially Norwegian bands. Like when I first started picking up Dark Throne, Satyricon, Emperor, and the likes, I thought time and time again how similar the vocal styles are to Quorthon's vocals in Bathory. Also, the general mood or atmosphere I feel in Bathory is much focused more on the darker side. Venom seemed to be like a wild bunch, like a kind of wild, dark party bunch in a way, whereas Bathory, I feel the atmosphere is more serious. So, yeah, I would put my vote towards Bathory as the band that actually kind of introduced the sound more than Venom did, but Venom do get credit for inspiring a lot of the first wave black metal bands to come, and of course playing a very important role in black metal overall. Venom were of course the band who really introduced the whole satanic imagery thing. Not that other bands hadn't done so before, but Venom really took it to a new level. Interestingly, I feel there is kind of a similarity between the arguments of who started black metal and who started heavy metal, where the argument about who started heavy metal, at least previously, was it Led Zeppelin or was it Black Sabbath? And then these days we say, well, Led Zeppelin did have the, heavy distorted chords and the guitar solos and a lot of energy in the music, but they are actually more like heavy blues rock or hard rock, not heavy metal. Black Sabbath was the band that introduced more of the heavy metal sound that we associate with heavy metal today. And even nowadays, some people are saying Black Sabbath are just a heavy rock band and not true heavy metal. All right, but we see a kind of similar argument there too. Like, did Venom actually introduce the concept of black metal? Did they create black metal, or were they actually playing just like, you know, speed metal and just had some black metal concepts? And it was actually Bathory that had more of the sound that we associate with black metal today. Similar kind of argument, anyway. I just thought that was kind of interesting. So one interesting point is that listening to what people said on these different YouTube channels I watched, as well as what I read, black metal is not exactly a style of music. It is considered more like an era. Like, this was a period in heavy metal history where extreme metal was really starting to unfold, basically. And, you know, the more common popular type, which was thrash metal, everybody knew about, you know, Metallica, Megadeth, Anthrax, Testament, and Exodus, and so on. But black metal was, the first wave black metal was the other side of thrash metal that was darker. It was, you know, there was more of this satanic element. The recordings were rougher. There was more of a, I think, a kind of primal, almost primitive feel to a lot of the music that these bands were producing. I think thrash metal very quickly graduated to something that was more technical and more advanced musically, whereas first wave black metal, for most of the bands, until they got their first or second full-length album out, they were in that kind of murkier sounding category type thing. In fact, the blog site here, Thrown into the Fire, he says, please stop calling it first wave. Instead, recognize that the music was simply extreme metal that combined to varying degrees elements of thrash metal and speed metal and what would become death metal and black metal. And I found this was a very interesting point because, especially regarding the brutality of some of the music, it does feel closer to what would become death metal. Regarding some of the more deeper, gruffer vocals, sounds like a step towards death metal vocals. And of course, then we also get some of the more back of the throat, banshee-like demonic vocals, which lend more towards the black metal style that is to come. So yeah, I do feel you've got the speed and thrash element, but you have these other elements which are going to later on become death metal or black metal. There was even a little bit of doom metal riffing in some of the songs, I noticed. So based on all the information I gathered about what people were saying or writing about, and then my own listening experience, I think there are 4 criteria to identify a first wave black metal album. So first of all, the musical style of these albums combines different subgenres of extreme metal music, such as thrash, speed metal, death and black metal, war metal, hardcore punk, and crust punk even. There may be some doom metal riffs in some of the songs too, as I just mentioned just before. The vocals are coarse, they're aggressive, and voluminous. Kronos of Venom used a Lemmy-inspired gruff, shouted vocal approach, but added more snarls and sneers, whereas Quorthon vocalized with a demonic kind of back-of-the-throat style. Tom Warrior of Celtic Frost took Lemmy's gruff vocals a step further by vocalizing lower and more roughly and adding more growl and rumble. And I think some of the other bands really brought in that kind of more deeper death metal type vocal almost, or they focused on putting in lots of growls or other kinds of vocalizations to emphasize a kind of deeper, darker, demonic feel to their vocal sound. So this is true for nearly all of the bands who fall into this category. Third point is satanic imagery. That is really the reason why it is black metal. It is black metal because it is black, it is darkness, it is Satan, it is hell, and it is all that kind of stuff. So even though there are some bands who musically don't fit in the first 2 categories, they fit in the third one because they sang about Satan and hell and they had the satanic imagery. So that is a very crucial point to black metal and what first wave black metal, and what of course ties first wave black metal into black metal of what was to come. The one distinction I would make is that a lot of the black metal bands of the 90s developed rapidly from the pure kind of satanic lyrics and began focusing more in on kind of pagan beliefs or Norse beliefs. And, you know, a band like Immortal, they focused more on this almost kind of like, you know, imaginary northern landscape, which they sang about rather than singing songs about Satan and hell all the time. So one of the interesting things too is Running Wild, who are actually considered the founders of pirate metal. Their first two albums also featured more satanic imagery and lyrics, or imagery in the lyrics, and so Running Wild's first two albums are often also included in black metal, first wave black metal lists. And as I've been saying a couple of times already, I think the fourth point is the lo-fi production. A lot of these first wave black metal albums have a really murky, muddy sound where it's often difficult to distinguish the guitars from the bass. I sometimes feel like the guitar is just a distortion sound over top of the kind of low tone of the bass beneath, and you can't really distinguish the instruments apart from each other in a lot of these recordings. The drumming as well, sometimes it's very fast, of course, but it's also very loud. The snare drums are often very loud, but other percussion around the drum set is often more muted in the mix, and sometimes the vocals are up near the front of the mix as well. So there's a kind of very murky, unclean sound about it, which I suppose is part of the charm of it all. So again, you can kind of imagine this Mad Max type vehicle, you know, with flames coming out of the muffler and a snarly demonic face on the front and spikes and iron plating and everything coming out everywhere, which again is a kind of a different image of my impression of thrash metal, which is more of a street-wary, street-savvy, what vehicle to use on the streets of the town, where you don't need to have big spikes sticking out everywhere. Okay, so one of the other points that I found really interesting is when we speak about thrash metal, like kind of pure thrash metal, most of it seems to come out of the States, particularly the West Coast scene around California, with, of course, mentioned bands like Overkill, Anthrax from the East Coast, and, of course, bands from Canada as well, with like Annihilator, Razor, Voivod being a unique case, because I find early Voivod has that same kind of loose, rough, rattling kind of sound to the music, but of course their lyrics were more science fiction, and never did they ever mention anything about Satan or hell in their lyrics that I can recall. I think not. They were the science fiction band. So yeah, but the first wave black metal bands, they seem to be international, like around the world. It's not so much just a focus on the States. And I guess I have to say that thrash bands also existed in the UK, and you could say basically they existed everywhere. It just depends on if they went for the darker side, then they were more first wave black metal than just pure thrash. But again, what we see is this kind of darker, murkier sound, this satanic imagery. It's global. So I think just here's a list from the UK. We have Venom and Onslaught. From Italy and Greece, we have Bulldozer and Rotting Christ, respectively. Denmark, of course, Merciful Fate. And from Norway, Early Mayhem. From Germany, we have the early releases of Sodom. Creator's debut album is often mentioned in first wave discussions. Destruction's early release, the EP, and sometimes the first album, Running Wild, like I said, also from Germany. And there are also interesting bands like a band called Poison, which I'd never heard about, but they also really have that black metal sound to them. And another band, Holy Moses, which I haven't even listened to yet. I've just heard them mentioned. Switzerland gives us Celtic Frost, and Sweden gives us Bathory. In Eastern Europe, we have Tormentor from Hungary, Root, Tor, and Master's Hammer from Czech, and Kat, capital K-A-T, and Imperator from Poland. So South America, of course, Sarcophago, Volcano, Sepultura from Brazil, Parabellum and Blasphemy from Colombia. Japan, we had Sabbath. And Canada, also a band named Blasphemy. And depending on who you ask, the first albums by Sacrifice and Infernal Majesty also sometimes get mentioned. As for the US, Slayer actually get mentioned because they were very big on the satanic imagery in the beginning, and I do feel that Slayer's early albums, at least up to Hell Awaits anyway, are quite different from the Metallica, Exodus, Testament style of thrash metal. I do feel Slayer had that kind of more hellish, more extreme, kind of closer to first wave black metal, but lyrically also sometimes a bit closer to what death metal would become. My impression anyway. So Slayer and of course Possessed actually said to be perhaps the first band to create death metal, or was it death? You know, again, we have this, you know, who did it type discussion. But Possessed, of course, their first album also had the inverted cross, the devil's tail, and some, you know, lyrics, again, about, you know, hell and Satan and that kind of thing. So Possessed have been mentioned in the discussion, but I guess they're more associated with death metal traditionally, or just thrash metal. So again, we're looking at in 1980s extreme metal, where it's like it encompasses within it, are encompassed elements of different types of extreme metal, which would branch out later on with future bands and future albums. So let's see here. What I gather from listening to a lot of these different samples was that America was more of a breeding ground for traditional thrash, and then, or should I say straight up thrash, and then giving us the you know, the Floridian scene in death metal, and of course the East Coast scene in death metal. And American thrash took more influence from new wave of British heavy metal and punk, whereas other bands in other parts of the world, particularly Europe, they took a lot of their influence from hardcore and crust punk type bands like I think like Discharge or Crass. Discharge especially gets mentioned by bands like Celtic Frost and Bathory. So yeah, it's a different type of punk that helps to influence that. And it was kind of interesting reading the history of Hellhammer on Wikipedia, where they said just, you know, 1982, 1983, there really wasn't a heck of a lot of extreme metal around, right? So if you liked metal music and you wanted to hear something more extreme, you had to turn to crust punk or hardcore punk. And so it was just really, maybe inevitable that metal bands would start to borrow or adopt those elements into the music to create a more extreme type of metal. Okay, so after that long kind of discussion about what I learned about first wave black metal, I'd like to talk about some of the different albums that I have, just give a few words about them. So of course, Venom's second album in 1982, Black Metal, having the song Black Metal, and the other album, their debut album, Welcome to Hell. Both of these albums have a really lo-fi, murky sound to them. In fact, compared to a lot of the black metal albums that I'm going to talk about after, I find the sound is almost one of the lowest quality type sounds. Of course, we're talking 81, 82. We're talking about a band that came out of Newcastle upon Tyne, so, you know, completely different place compared to a lot of the other new wave of British heavy metal bands. And I think it was Abaddon of Venom who said in an interview that he didn't feel Venom were part of the new wave of British heavy metal scene because they were doing something that was really different. And yeah, the sound of their album is kind of a testimony to that as well. It is a really murky sound. But of course, Venom, you know, they're the ones who came up with this look, featuring satanic imagery on the covers of their albums and lots of lyrics about hell and death and Satan and so on. So yeah, they really, you know, brought that forward to the table. So probably the most important band, I think, in the discussion of first wave black metal, Bathory, their debut album from 1984. You know, I listened to this back in the 80s a lot, and when I started buying albums of 1990s black metal, and then I bought this on CD and went and listened to it, I really felt I could hear the influence of this album on those later ones. My personal favorite is this second album, The Return. This is an album that I just still love to listen to every time. For me, there is no greater Bathory album than this. The album after that, Under the Sign of the Black Mark, is often considered, or at least by many, to be the first black metal album. And I had it on cassette, but it just wasn't as good to my ears as the first two albums, and so I haven't bought it on CD yet, but it seems that it's an important one for me to get. And more recently, maybe 2-3 years ago, I picked up Blood, Fire, Death because there was just so much talk about what a great album this is. And I do really like it. But if we're going to say that Bathory are more of a thrash band than true black metal band, I feel a lot of the songs on here capture that more traditional sounding thrash style and just keep the black metal vocals. Whereas I personally feel these two albums have more of an early dark element to them, which is not found in usual thrash. So again, stylistically, one of the most important bands, Celtic Frost here with their Morbid Tales EP. I bought this when it first came out, and man, did I love it. I think along with Bathory's The Return, this one here, they are two of my favorite extreme metal albums of the 80s. I get this kind of like speaking to an old friend feeling every time I listen to them. And of course, To Megatherion after that is considered among the best when it comes to first wave black metal, or even lists of thrash metal, or even elements of proto-death metal. There's just so much on this album. I really love that they actually kept the kind of heavy riffing and sound from this album, but they added in things like the operatic vocals and the heavy brass section. These two albums I find are really, really great. Of course, I had Hellhammer Apocalyptic Raids on cassette in the 80s. I only remember the one track with all the really kind of agonized screaming and groaning. And I thought, yeah, maybe I don't really need that. And I even remember like Tom Warrior just had a lot of things, negative views about that album, saying like it wasn't really the direction that they wanted the band to be growing in, which is why they ended up, you know, finishing up that band and then starting up Celtic Frost. But listening to it again the other day on the internet, I really hear the early Celtic Frost sound in there. So yeah, I've got to pick it up. And for that matter, I've got to pick up Slayer's debut album, because that is one I actually never had, Show No Mercy, even though I have, you know, the next 5 after that. So of course, in the discussions of first wave of black metal, this is one of the most important albums. People ranking this usually very highly. I think the guy on Quest for Metal put this in his S tier, which is at the very top. Merciful Fate's debut, well anyway, Melissa, they did have an album, self-titled album before this, but was that an EP? I forget. Anyway, here we have the reissue that came out a few years ago, and actually I'm really kicking myself for not picking up Don't Break the Oath at the time. I had it in my Amazon shopping cart. I knew I should get it and I didn't, and now it's like twice the price to find it new. But anyway, the music on here is not at all like any of the other albums we've been looking at, or we will look at. This is like classic or traditional heavy metal, but it is of a higher level. I feel like there is a lot of like 70s prog or heavy prog feel to a lot of it. Like there are lots of different changes in the riffs and time signatures. It's more advanced than just your standard traditional heavy metal. The overall impression I have is, listening to this again, is that Merciful Fate and King Diamond are a bit more like, I feel they are like the classic heavy metal or black metal, satanic classic heavy metal version of Alice Cooper in a way, because I feel the scope of the music and maybe the themes of the songs and just the overall, the way they are sung or the way they are represented just seems more theatrical and grandiose than just your standard early 80s heavy metal band. And so I feel there's that connection with Alice Cooper in a way like that. But I only have one Alice Cooper album, so what the hell do I know? Hey, okay. So anyway, Merciful Fate and King Diamond, both of them very closely related to first wave black metal, even though the style of the music is really much more like traditional heavy metal with a strong progressive element to it. One of the very important ones, Sarcophago from Brazil, Inri from 1987. This here is interesting in particular. First of all, there are these like deep demonic growls going on behind the vocals themselves being very deep and gruff. But the drumming is of particular interest because it's very high speed, and I don't believe it is exactly a true blast beat, but it is faster than your standard speed metal drumming. And I think listening to the drummers, there's a kind of maximum speed that you can achieve with a standard, you know, like hand beat on the snare drum. It's like there's a limit. No matter how fast the songs the guitar players are playing, the drums seem to manage a dun 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 like as a maximum speed. And we know from death metal and later black metal that there are much faster beats that are accomplished. But here I feel he actually does achieve a higher beat rate than most of the other bands that we've been talking about. Very important album, often ranking in the top and certainly commonly mentioned. Brazil, the extreme metal scene in Brazil in the 1980s did also heavily focus on that more satanic sound in the beginning, until bands kind of matured and then went more in a thrash metal direction, or even, you know, in the case of Sepultura, they eventually moved on in other directions as well. And here they are, Sepultura, the 1985 release Morbid Visions, their first full-length album. This one here, quite different from their later thrashier sounding albums that would come out in the late 80s. So again, this, fast playing, that kind of thrashy style, but again, the kind of more murkier recording and the deeper vocals, and of course, satanic imagery in the lyrics as well. So yeah, those two, and then one other band from Brazil that's going to come up, that I have really tell us a lot about what was happening with the scene in Brazil at the time. And we also want to take a look at Sodom. So they formed actually in 1981. Their EP, In the Sign of Evil, came out in 1985, and then Obsessed by Cruelty, their first full-length album, came out in 1986. This album definitely is one of the top mentioned albums in first wave black metal. Again, satanic lyrics, murky recording, very aggressive sounding music. And this one here is slightly cleaner, and some people saying it's a little closer to thrash, while other people saying it's still an important album in the first wave black metal scene. I do feel it. And the next album after that, Persecution Mania, that was my first Sodom album I got. The first time I listened to it, I actually felt that it was interesting. A lot of the European thrash bands had that kind of darker, gruffer vocal, which I felt was pointing the way towards death metal, but it seems to, now as I understand it, have come out of the first wave black metal style. Just everybody wanted to be meaner, tougher, darker. That was just the vibe at the time, to go that way. So this is the reissue of Creator's Endless Pain. I really don't like all this dark crap that they put on here. It looks like the album has been, left too close to a campfire or something. I never had this. I had, of course, Pleasure to Kill on cassette, and I've had it on CD. I have a couple of other Creator albums, and I finally got this one. I was kind of hesitant for a long time about getting it, but I heard how important it is in the first wave black metal, so I wanted to hear the roots of Creator. This is an album that seems to mostly go for blasting its way through every song. My first impression listening to this was just that every song has to be full tilt. There, of course, are some variations in the intros, but no matter what they do with the intros of the song, they very quickly go into, let's play as fast as possible for the rest of the song. So I didn't feel there was as much variety in that way, but after listening to it a couple of more times, I'm at least starting to distinguish, which tracks I like more than others. But yeah, this is basically a very speedy album, and again, really gruff, dark vocals, and of course, being the debut album, not such clear production. And I think part of it is, of course, that these bands, for their debuts, are recording in lower budget studios, I guess. They don't have such high-level producer. But another thing is that these people are the pioneers. They are taking music to new levels and new territories. And I think the studios just didn't know how to record music like that. They didn't have the techniques down pat, and so a lot of these early recordings do sound really crappy, which again is part of the charm. It was the same with a lot of the DIY in punk music, or even an early new wave of British heavy metal music. It just had that kind of more raw, rough sound, which gave it more of a very honest, visceral feeling, rather than very clean and polished and well rehearsed. So this one was rather new to me. This is Onslaught and Power from Hell, their 1985 debut release. This one I feel sounds much more like a thrash album. I feel there is more precision in the music. The recording quality is a little cleaner than a lot of the other ones, and just a lot of the elements I find in old school thrash, or early, late 80s, whatever, 80s thrash, is more prevalent in here. Even the vocals are not quite as demonic. They're kind of in that gray zone, I feel, between thrash vocals and first wave black metal vocals. Nevertheless, they do have this, Power from Hell. The opening track comes out with, I am the Lord Satan, and this kind of thing. So, yeah, they have songs like The Devil's Legion, Angels of Death. Interestingly, there's a song on here called Death Metal, which they recorded back in 1984, and Possessed also released their debut in 1985 with a song called Death Metal, which they also recorded back in 1984. And there's actually one more band we'll talk about who have a song called Death Metal as well. So while, Venom may have kicked off the whole black metal thing, and that's what we're calling it these days. It seems that the concept of death metal was also going on among these basically thrash-based bands with a darker and satanic imagery about them. I think Onslaught would be probably one of the first candidates to shed the satanic imagery and go in for more straight thrash, but I haven't really heard anything else of theirs. This was kind of a new thing to me. I didn't even know there was a big four of British thrash in the 1980s. It's all a learning experience. So here we go with Volcano, and this is the other band I keep mentioning that have a song called Death Metal, also a band coming out of Brazil. This here, I was quite surprised to find it for a very reasonable price. It is used but really clean condition, but when I took a good look at the Obi card on the back, I realized it's Chinese. Now this CD here looks really good, looks very professional, but the original album seems to have been taken from vinyl because I can hear the scratches and pops in places that tell me it's a vinyl record and not just, you know, a bad recording. So we do have this, you know, typical murky, dark, very aggressive recording style that's, you know, typical of these 1980s first wave black metal bands, but we also have, you know, the fact that it's taken from a piece of vinyl. So that does make me a little suspicious, you know, that it came from China and it's on a piece of vinyl. I don't know if other copies are the same. If that's how they did it, maybe there were no master tapes available, there was nothing else but vinyl available, or just someone made this album copy from vinyl and there actually exists another version somewhere else. The cool thing is that there is one more track at the very end, which is a later recording, which has a really awesome thrash metal sound to it and very nicely recorded. I really like the sound of that, which actually makes me feel like checking out other recordings by the band. Anyway, that's Volcano. When was this one from? Volcano formed in 1981 and Bloody Vengeance is from 1986. Still a few more to go. So this is the Day of Wrath, Bulldozer from Italy. I think this was the debut album. This is from 1985. Yeah, so we really find this basically 1984 is kind of the really beginning, and then a lot of albums coming out between 85 and 87, which have very similar sound and style. So I think that's probably like the core period in during that first wave black metal time. So this one I feel is a little different from the others. It has more of a Venom influence in it, meaning there's still a little bit more of a, almost like a groove to it, because, you know, Venom coming out in the early 80s, they're carrying with them a lot of the styles of the 70s, which they're then changing over into their style. So I feel Venom's has a little more of that kind of heavy blues rock or kind of groove feel sometimes. Think like 1,000 Days in Sodom, that bass solo. I mean, that's really like a kind of 70s feel to it. So anyway, I do feel there is that in this album. But of course, again, we do have the gruff vocals and of course the, love the picture on the back. The guy, the tongue sticking out. I'll put that here. Yeah, just songs with themes about things like what we have, like Fallen Angel and, well, they do have a very funny one on here called Whiskey Time. It's fucking whiskey time. Which is actually kind of a more fun thing, which is more associated, I think, with some thrash metal bands. Then, of course, we have a big classic one, Tormentor. I find the story behind this really interesting because this band was recording in Hungary behind the Iron Curtain. And the story I read was that, you know, the officials, the authorities, were really wary of a youth band playing Western rock or metal music, and they were watched very carefully. But they did actually, with their manager, they were able to get in to record an album and actually perform some shows, again being watched very carefully that they didn't start filling the heads of the Hungarian youth with some kind of Western ideas. But after some time, when it seemed that their band was starting to go somewhere, their manager suddenly disappeared. And after that, the band ceased activity for a while, at least until Hungary finally became released from the Iron Curtain and could become a democratic nation again. This album is also famous for having Attila on lead vocals, the guy who went on to sing for Mayhem. So very wild type vocals if you know his vocal style. Pretty good album, lots of cool songs and riffs. There's some kind of additional kind of atmosphere. I guess that might be because of their Hungarian background, like a kind of more like a haunting type thing to it. I don't know, because like what, Vlad the Impaler was imprisoned in Budapest in an underground cell in a mountain. So yeah, Vlad the Impaler, Dracula, right? So maybe there's that kind of a feel to the music. But again, we're talking about pretty lo-fi recording, at least how it sounds on here. You really have to put up with that, kind of like looking at really grainy old photographs for enjoyment. Yeah, but Tormentor, very important one. So then we talk about Destruction and their first full-length album, Infernal Overkill, which I had on cassette in the 80s. I always felt this was a thrash album, but again, with songs like what the Ritual, Antichrist, Black Death. I mean, there are songs on here that go for that, again, that first wave black metal sound. The vocals, again, are darker, rougher, more from back of the throat rather than thrash metal style. So yeah, I can understand this getting associated with first wave black metal. Again, their EP before this is the one that gets mentioned much more often than this one, but I did see this one listed in a list of top 10 first wave black metal albums, so that's kind of interesting. Oh yeah, then we got to move on to, oh by the way, that is what, this is from, yeah, again, 1985, the kind of magic year for first wave black metal albums, and their EP 1984, same year as Bathory's debut. So then we go, what, Mayhem Death Crush in 1987. Now this is interesting because Mayhem is actually one of the bands very much associated with the 1990s black metal style, especially Norway, Euronymous being the one who was kind of like the center of that whole community with his Shop Helvet. This is very interesting because this is a different sound of Mayhem. It is, again, there is that speed metal or thrash metal feel to it, but they do also have the kind of more mid-tempo heavy riffs, very raw guitar sound, and also a very cleaner recording because we can hear the distinction between the guitars and the bass, which have a wonderful growly sound. The drums are very fast, and in a way, I'm not sure if it is the drumming style or just an artifact of the recording, but I often feel like the snare seems to be going really, really fast. And I'm not sure if it is actually the snare itself, the beats that are going that fast, or if there isn't an echo, so that with each beat we hear an echo before the next beat. We also hear a lot of double kick bass on here, which also gives that faster paced feel. That's something I noticed on these other albums. Not everybody's doing a double kick drum. When it shows up, I'm kind of surprised because a lot of bands are going more for the speed by either doing the fast snare hits or doing something like a D beat or something where they're, you know, doing the kind of alternating between the snare hit and the double kick, you know, to get the kind of faster beat going. But anyway, really cool sounding album. The beginning is a bit weird, but the rest of the songs on here really raw and energetic and capturing that kind of almost maniacal feel to the vocals and overall sound of the music. So now we're going to start getting a little bit into the gray area. This is Sacrifice, Torment and Fire, their debut album, which came out in 1986. I've heard people mention, like, they became more of a thrash band, even a technical thrash band, but I've heard it mentioned that their first album does have kind of a black metal feel to it. They are not specifically singing songs about hell or Satan, but we have things like The Awakening, which actually sounds something like from Evil Dead. Of course, Sacrifice, yeah, I don't know, Warrior in Infernal Visions, Warrior of Death, Burned at the Stake, Necronomicon. This is, I feel, closer to kind of an Evil Dead inspired album. The overall sound also is very much like Slayer's Hell Awaits, I feel, like and Haunting the Chapel. That style, I think they were very much inspired by those two albums. The sound of the guitars, the song structures, the riffs, and even like the dive bombing guitars are very strong on here. The vocals, though, are a little bit more deeper in some cases than your typical thrash. So that might be why they can sometimes be considered possibly in the first wave of black metal. And then it was S&T Young who included Infernal Majesty, None Shall Defy in his list of black metal albums. I also felt that specifically because of the vocals that it does have that more darker, gruffer sound, which is not the same as thrash metal. And I don't know, Night of the Living Dead, Skeletons in the Closet, Anthology of Death. Yeah, I would say it's a thrash metal album, but with hints, concepts closer to death metal, maybe a forthcoming death metal. That was my impression when I first heard it. But again, you know, death metal, black metal, thrash metal, all being kind of grouped together in this first wave black metal. Basically, 80s extreme metal. And then we go on with Blasphemy, who formed in 1984 in Vancouver. Fallen Angel of Doom, their first full-length album in 1990. Holy crap, this one is really different. Like, if you consider that first wave black metal albums have this raw recording sound and really gruff, deep vocals, this is like at the core of everything. The recording sound is really so raw. I often really can't at all. I feel there's like the vocals, there's the snare drum, and everything else is just kind of like muddied together beneath that. It's almost like two antennas sticking up from this really black, murky darkness in the center. And the vocals are really low and gruff, and again, much more like death metal, I would think. So again, we're looking at that first wave black metal having that vocal sound a little bit closer to death metal than thrash, and it is really deep on here, with a secondary vocal track in sometimes that is even darker and demonic. So yeah, really murky, deep, dark, extreme stuff here. I often feel like listening to this, it's like the band was playing live in a basement bar and it was recorded from street level outside. That's how kind of dense and murky and, you know, clustered together the sound feels. But also Blasphemy, known for being like one of the first war metal bands. Almost coming to the end here. This is Sabbath from Japan and Venom, their first album. And in Venom, does that ever kind of say it? There is a lot of Venom influence on here, although there is some Celtic Frost in here from time to time as well. Let's see here. Sabbath actually formed in the early 80s, and they released 5 7-inch releases in the 1980s, and Venom finally coming out in 1991. And this is something I find with a lot of the bands. They had all these like demos and 7-inch singles that they released during the 80s, and then many of them finally got their debut albums released by the end of the 80s or early 90s, where the first wave is basically coming to an end, but it still captures that sound and style. Quite like this one, actually. I'm going to be looking at another album or two of theirs, if not more. So this one here, kind of interesting. This is Rotting Christ, their debut album, Thy Mighty Contract, from 1983. And the thing that's interesting about this is I watched a video some years back of Fenriz describing what inspired the second wave of black metal and his band Dark Throne, and he did mention Rotting Christ, and they had some singles or demos, whatever, released during the late 80s, so it wasn't until 93 before the first album came out. And so this is different from what we've been talking about so far, and I do feel it has its own kind of atmosphere. Again, Rotting Christ coming from Greece, so they're going to have some kind of a different input compared to everybody else. They do have, I think there were some times with some keyboards or something to give it more of that kind of cathedral type darkness feel. But again, you know, just the title, Rotting Christ, the name of the band, there is that kind of, you know, satanic feeling to it. So I'm not really sure how this fits in, because it doesn't sound like a second wave black metal album, but it sounds really distinct from other first wave black metal. This might be something unique on its own. And then the last one here is Master's Hammer. They are from Prague, Czech, formed in 1983. Ritual, their debut album. I have it here as a 1981 release, is it? 1981. This one is the latest one I brought home, and I've only listened to it through twice, but it sounds really freaking good. Like, it's a very nice recording. The guitar sound is awesome. Vocals are really crazy. Black metal style vocals, kind of a little bit more in tune of the second wave of black metal, with that more kind of Bathory type, banshee, demonic screeching, I don't know, back of the throat type of feeling to it. But really cool songs, really cool riffs, great sound. Just everything is sung in the native Czech language, so I can't even read the song titles, but there are some really awesome tracks on here. All right, so yeah, there are still some bands that I may want to check out later on. There's still some albums by these bands I may want to get, but that's probably making this video very long so far. But that is my journey into first wave black metal for the third time in my life now. So yeah, go ahead, feel free to leave any comments that you want to say, which albums you think are also worth checking out, and, you know, whatever you want to say about this video. Comments are always welcome. I really enjoy hearing what people have to say, and I always reply. So thanks everyone for watching. See you again in another video coming soon. Take care all, and bye.